You know how everyone keeps saying nobody wants to work anymore?
Yeah.
Well, you've brought us a ton of sources that really make you think twice about that whole idea.
It's a phrase you hear everywhere.
It is.
And I think it's often used to, just blame people.
Right, like it's just a simple explanation.
Right.
But the sources you've brought in suggest it's way more complicated than that.
Absolutely. It's not as simple as people just being lazy or entitled.
Okay, so let's dive into this.
Yeah.
What are we looking at today? What kind of sources?
Well, we've got a mix of things. We've got economic data, we've got surveys, we've got some really interesting anecdotes about what's happening in different parts of the country.
Anecdotes are my favorite.
Oh, they're so good.
Yeah.
They really bring these trends to life,
Right, you can really relate.
Exactly. And I think what we're trying to do with this deep dive is get past those easy explanations and really understand what's going on with work money and even where you live, because that plays a bigger role than you might think.
So it's not just about lazy millennials.
It's not just about millennials,
Okay, good to know.
although they often get blamed.
They do. It's like the go-to complaint, right?
Right?
Out-of-touch executive can't find workers while sipping their latte.
Exactly. But it's just not that simple.
So where we start?
Well, I think we have to start by understanding what labor force participation even means.
Okay, back to basics.
Right. So it's basically the percentage of the population that's either employed or actively looking for work.
Got it.
And while overall participation is lower than you might expect in a supposedly strong economy, it's the reasons behind it that are really interesting.
Okay, so let's unpack those reasons.
Yeah.
We have to address the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
All those stereotypes about lazy millennials, Gen Z, demanding unrealistic salaries, ghost jobs. And we've all heard it.
Oh, we've heard it all. And look, it's easy to fall into that trap of thinking it's all about generational differences.
Right.
But the data tells a different story. When you look at the labor force participation rate for people between 25 and 54.
So prime working age?
Exactly. It's actually pretty high. So the real story is at the edges with the youngest and oldest workers.
Okay, so what's going on with those groups? Let's start with the older workers.
Yeah.
The sources mentioned they're retiring earlier than expected, and it's not just because they're hitting that traditional retirement age of 65 or whatever.
Right. Things like rising asset prices, particularly in housing, those big jumps in home values we've seen.
Right.
And even those generous severance packages that some companies were offering during the pandemic, those are having an impact.
So people are feeling more financially secure and they're saying peace out.
In some cases, yes. And this is fascinating because it's a complete reversal of the trend we saw just a few years ago where people were delaying retirement.
Yeah, I remember those conversations.
People worried about outliving their savings.
So could this mean that older generations are kind of benefiting from these economic trends while younger generations are struggling to even get a foot in the door?
That's definitely a question worth exploring.
Yeah.
It gets at this issue of financial security for different demographics. Older workers might have benefited from a booming housing market, or they might have pensions, which are less common now.
Right.
While younger workers are entering a market where those advantages just aren't there as much.
Okay, so we've got older workers retiring earlier. Then there's the education piece. More young people are going to college, which obviously means they're not entering the workforce right away.
Right.
But then we have these stories, like the one about that Berkeley professor, whose top computer science students can't find decent jobs.
I know, it's like Berkeley.
And they can't get jobs.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, what's the point of a degree if it doesn't actually lead to a job?
And that's the problem, right? There's this vicious cycle. You get a degree, you get student loan debt, then those low-paying entry-level jobs don't even cover your expenses, so you feel like you need to get more education, which just delays entering the workforce even longer.
It's like the system is working against them.
In a way, yes.
And speaking of systems, the sources highlight this really interesting case study, West Virginia.
Oh, yes.
It has the lowest labor force participation in the entire U.S.
It does.
But here's the thing. The numbers are wildly different depending on which county you're looking at. It goes from 42% all the way up to 77%.
Huge variation.
Why is that?
I think West Virginia is a perfect illustration of what some experts call the can't afford to work, can't afford to move dilemma.
Okay. Explain that to me.
So some areas simply don't have enough jobs.
Right.
But moving to places with more opportunity is incredibly expensive.
Especially now. Yeah.
Exactly. Think about it. Moving costs money. Finding housing costs money if you're already struggling. How do you even make that leap?
It's like a catch-22.
It really is.
So location really seems to be a huge factor.
Oh, absolutely.
But it's not just about where you live. It's also about what you expect to earn And speaking of expectations, get this, one of our sources says the Gen Z thinks they need almost $600,000 a year to be financially successful.
Wow.
Right? $600,000.
That's a big number.
It is, especially when you compare it to the national median income, which is something like $70,000.
Big difference.
Even baby boomers who grew up in a time of economic prosperity, they think 100,000 is enough to be successful.
Interesting.
So why this huge gap between what Gen Z thinks they need and what other generations think is enough?
Well, I think it's tempting to just say, oh, it's entitlement, but our sources suggest it's more than that. Social media definitely plays a role.
Of course.
It presents this very distorted view of wealth. It's all curated perfection and overnight success stories.
And everyone's on vacation all the time.
Exactly. And that can really skew people's perception of what's realistic, especially for a generation that's grown up online.
So are we saying they've been misled by social media, or are they just completely out of touch with the real world?
I don't think it's either. I think we need to consider that Gen Z hasn't had the same experiences with the economy as previous generations. They came of age during a time of recessions, stagnant wages, skyrocketing housing costs. Their whole perception of what's normal is different.
Okay, so maybe we need to cut them some slack.
I think a little empathy goes a long way.
So this whole nobody wants to work narrative, it's not really accurate, is it?
It's a huge oversimplification. It ignores the systemic issues, the economic realities facing different generations, the challenges of finding affordable housing, dealing with student loan debt, navigating a job market that's changing all the time.
It's just way more complex than people want to admit.
I think so.
And I think we're just scratching the surface of this conversation.
We are.
There's so much more to unpack here, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on what all of this means for individuals who are actually trying to navigate this complicated landscape.
Yeah, we should definitely dig into that.
We'll do that in our next segment. We've been talking about all these big trends, but let's get real for a second.
Yeah.
Imagine you're a young person, just starting out. Maybe you just graduated college. Maybe you have some student loans you're trying to figure out.
Right.
What do you do next?
Well, you're stepping into this world where everyone's telling you to hustle. You got to be an entrepreneur. You need a side hustle.
Oh, yeah, side hustles.
And you're scrolling through social media, and everyone your age seems to be living this amazing life.
Yeah, it's like everyone's on vacation all the time or buying a house.
Exactly. And it creates this pressure to achieve a level of success that honestly might not even be possible for most people.
Right. It's like this impossible standard.
And then on top of those unrealistic expectations, the
Right.
job market itself is so competitive.
Oh, yeah.
It's tough to get your foot in the door, especially if you don't live in one of those big cities where all the jobs seem to be.
So you're dealing with these high expectations and limited options. And if you're stuck in a place like West Virginia, where we talked about those limited job opportunities, it can feel like there's no way out.
Absolutely. And that can be so frustrating.
It can.
It can lead to people giving up on the whole idea of a traditional job.
Which feeds into that whole nobody wants to work narrative.
Exactly. But it's not about laziness. It's about this mismatch between what people expect and what's actually available and what they can afford.
So how do we fix that mismatch? Is it as simple as telling Gen Z, hey, you need to lower your expectations, or is this a sign that we need some big changes?
I don't think it's about telling people to dream smaller. I think it's about promoting financial literacy, understanding how much things actually cost, and debunking those social media myths about getting rich quick.
So being realistic.
Exactly, and helping people understand what it actually takes to be financially secure in this day and age.
It feels like so much of this comes down to education. And I don't just mean college. I mean life skills, financial skills, just understanding how the world works.
I completely agree. We need to equip people with the tools they need to succeed.
But we also have to acknowledge that there are these bigger systemic issues, right? Like the lack of affordable housing, the rising cost of education, the fact that so many opportunities are concentrated in just a few places.
Absolutely. Those are huge problems, and they require big solutions.
So we're talking about policy changes, investing in infrastructure, maybe even finding ways to encourage businesses to create jobs in areas that have been left behind.
Right, and it's not just about government intervention. Businesses have a responsibility here, too.
What do you mean?
Well, they need to think about their hiring practices, offer competitive salaries, and create workplaces that value work-life balance.
Yeah, it's like we've all seen those memes about hustle culture and burnout.
Exactly. It's not sustainable.
And it's not just about being nice to employees. It's about attracting and keeping good people.
Right. In this kind of job market, Companies that take care of their employees have a huge advantage.
So this whole nobody wants to work thing, it's not the whole story, is it?
It's a symptom of a much bigger issue. It's about how we think about work success and the role of employers.
And it's not just a problem to be solved. It's an ongoing conversation that we need to have.
Absolutely, we need to keep talking about this.
Okay, so we've laid out the problem, but what can we do about it? Where do we go from here?
Well, in our final segment, we're going to explore some practical advice and resources to help people navigate this evolving world of work.
Okay, so stay tuned. We'll be right back. Wow, we have talked about a lot, haven't we?
We have. It's a lot to take in.
It is. We've gone from these, kind of simplistic ideas about lazy workers to like this whole, deeper understanding of all the things that are really going on in the economy and with different generations.
Right, and I think it's clear that it's not as simple as people just not wanting to work.
Not at all.
It's about, expectations and opportunities and these big systemic problems that we need to figure out.
But I think for a lot of people listening, it can feel kind of overwhelming.
All right, I can see that.
You're trying to figure out your career and your finances, and it's like, where do I even start?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is to remember that the more you know, the better.
Knowledge is power.
Exactly. So do your research. Don't just believe everything you see on social media or what people tell you.
Right.
Look at salary data for the kind of work you're interested in. Think about the cost of living in different places and be realistic about your goals.
So I take off the rose-colored glasses.
Yeah, and maybe even figure out what you really want, not just what you think you should want.
Right, because maybe what you think you should want is based on someone else's idea of success.
Exactly. So what kind of work would actually make you happy? What kind of lifestyle do you want? What are the things you absolutely won't compromise on when it comes to a job?
It's about finding your own path.
I think so.
The sources we looked at also talk a lot about networking, which, can be kind of scary,
It can be.
especially if you're just starting out.
But it's so important.
It is.
It's not just about finding a job. It's about learning from other people and making connections and building relationships.
It's about building your community.
Right, and having people you can rely on.
And speaking of navigating this whole work thing, another thing that comes up a lot is this idea of adaptability,
Oh, yeah.
because the job market is changing so fast.
Constantly changing.
And the skills that are in demand today might be totally useless tomorrow.
That's why it's so important to be open to learning new things and maybe even changing your career path.
It's like that saying, the only constant is change.
Exactly. So instead of being afraid of change, maybe we need to embrace it.
Right, see it as an opportunity.
And if there's one thing I hope people take away from this whole conversation, it's this: don't buy into that nobody wants to work narrative.
It's just not true.
It's so simplistic and it misses all the nuances of what's really going on.
It's a scapegoat.
Yeah, and it prevents us from actually finding solutions.
So what should people focus on?
Focus on the things you can control. Build your skills network. Stay open to new opportunities.
And don't give up.
Exactly. And remember, you're not alone in this. There are so many people out there trying to figure this all out.
We're all in this together.
This whole deep dive has been about, questioning our assumptions and looking at the data and hopefully giving you the information you need to make good decisions.
And realizing that the future of work isn't set in stone.
Right. We're all creating it together.
So go out there, learn new things, connect with people, be kind to yourself, and don't be afraid to shake things up.
Maybe you'll be the one to create a workplace where everyone wants to work.
A place where people feel valued and fulfilled.
That's a great goal.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation.
It has.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time for another exploration of, well, who knows?
We'll find something interesting.
We always do.